Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Trine 2 for various systems, but what you're seeing here is the PC version. This review is coming to you courtesy of Frost. He sent me this, so thank you, it is greatly appreciated. This is a puzzle platformer by Frozenbyte and the sequel to Trine. It was released in December of 2011 for PC and Mac and later saw a release on a variety of other systems, and in fact was one of the launch titles for the PS4, which is kind of odd because by then it was a couple years old and, well, as I'm making this review, PS4 is still having issues with games that are worth playing on it, so it's kind of a weird situation with it. At any rate, I guess the question here is, how does this compare to the original Trine? Is it worth picking up? Did they make any improvements? Or what happened? Well, as far as the presentation goes, it's definitely a step up from the previous game. This game is gorgeous, and most of it is due to its very bright, colorful art style, as well as the absolutely fantastic lighting effects that this game has. And so the environments are just packed with detail, and the lighting gets this great visual atmosphere going. So even though you're not dealing with extremely high-res textures or utterly mind-boggling realistic modeling or anything like that, the visual style they've gone for is just incredibly good, and it just oozes charm at every single pore. And then there's the sound design, which also throws together a massive amount of charm. It's really designed to convey this very fairy tale, fantasy-esque vibe, and it succeeds brilliantly at it. The narrator sounds like what you would hear from a fairy tale story. The characters are suitably corny and kind of ridiculous, and so the voice actors did a very good job with them. The music is very much fantasy fairy tale-esque and lends a lot to this game. And so it's really nice to have a game that, while it does take itself a bit seriously up to a certain point, for the most part, it's just this kind of whimsical fairy tale fantasy story that just really oozes a lot of this wonderful, gleeful charm. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this takes place several years after the events of the original Trine, where the heroes have now gone their separate ways after restoring the kingdom, and eventually, while trying to learn the fireball spell that he never managed to learn, Amadeus the wizard is visited by the Trine. The Trine being this strange magical artifact that summoned all these heroes in the original game and brought them all together. And so it basically pulls the same thing it did in the original game, where it brings all these heroes together, and they have to go off on another quest to basically save a kingdom or save the world or whatever it might well be. They don't know to start with anyway. And so the Trine takes them somewhere else, and they're immediately finding themselves in a strange land filled with goblins that are attacking them, and these weird vines and things like that. And they come to find out a bit later on that they need to help save this kingdom from the evil that has befallen it. And unfortunately, I have to say that the plot lost me within 5 minutes. As charming as the game is, the plot is rather generic and doesn't really do a huge amount to keep you going in this game. It's not bad, but I've seen a lot better. I've seen a lot worse too. It's just kind of in the background, and it does its part to have a reason for the heroes to do what they're doing, but at the same time, you don't really get invested in it. You don't really get attached to any of these characters, so ultimately it really does fall to the gameplay to bring this thing up. Does it manage to do that? Well, yes and no. Yes, in that compared to the original Trine, it is basically an evolution. You're basically doing the same things you did in the original Trine, only they're done a bit smoother, a bit better here. And so you find yourself running around as Pontius the Knight, who has a sword and a shield. He's the only character who can block attacks with that shield. But he also has a hammer that he can use to smash through rock walls and do large amounts of damage and things like that. The wizard can create planks, if he upgrades later on, as well as boxes and things like that in order to help solve puzzles. And he can levitate objects, so that's really handy. And the thief has a bow, which, if you upgrade it, can actually freeze enemies, and also has a grappling hook, so she can swing into action, so to speak, and just span large gaps with relative ease. And so each of these characters have their own strengths and weaknesses, and you can, of course, do co-op play if you want, so instead of having to control all three characters, just switching between them, you can have each person, up to 3 players, playing a different character, and that will, of course, help out with puzzles and such like that. That said, the puzzles are pretty much what you would expect after having played the original Trine as well. They're generally physics-based things, or they are using the environment to scale a certain obstacle, and that's of course using whatever you have at your disposal, which in some cases might mean you have to smash a wall in order to get a piece of piping, in order to hook that up to another piece of piping so that you're now actually projecting flames away from the party as opposed to toward the party, and thus you can actually navigate. Or it might be a vent that you need to activate in order to be able to fly up to a certain spot, things like that. The puzzles themselves are really not all that hard to figure out. It's more the execution that is going to leave you scratching your head a bit. And part of that is due to the controls not exactly being 100% great. What I mean by that is, in particular if you're jumping, there seems to be a sort of delay between when you actually press the button and when you actually manage to jump. And it's not a huge delay, but it's enough that if you're trying to do a lot of very precise, fast jumping, it's not really going to work out all that well. And it's particularly annoying when you have to deal with enemies at the same time, so now you're sort of fighting the controls, not any great deal, but you also have these enemies to worry about, and they'll just knock you off of platforms and take you out very easily. Luckily, if you do manage to get one of your characters knocked out, they will get revived immediately upon walking up to the next checkpoint, so it's not that huge of a deal, it's just kind of annoying. But I think the main problem I have with this game is not that it's an incompetent puzzle platformer. It's actually a very, very competent puzzle platformer. Most of the puzzles are fairly straightforward. Like I said, they're physics-based, and it's pretty easy to see what you can do. But some of them will have you sitting there thinking about them for a bit, and the action itself is certainly nice to help change things up a bit compared to most other puzzle platformers. But my main problem is that it's almost exactly the same as the original Trine, it's just slightly tweaked. The problem there being, I wasn't a really big fan of the original Trine. Like most puzzle platformers, I'm not a big fan of it. It's okay, and if it's your kind of game, you'll probably be able to get something out of it. But again, it's almost exactly the same as the original Trine, just slightly tweaked. You're still going around solving these physics-based puzzles for the most part, and they're fairly straightforward. You're still switching between the various characters or playing it in co-op. You're still having the occasional boss fight and things like that. And it's more interesting than most puzzle platformers out there, where it's just a straight-up puzzle platformer that is done for the sake of the puzzle platforming. And this one's more as a fairy tale thing that happens to be a puzzle platformer. But at the same time, it grows thin pretty quickly. And so what ends up happening here is pretty much the same thing that happened with the original Trine for me. I lost interest very quickly. It's not a bad game by any stretch of the imagination. Like I said, it's a very competent puzzle platformer, and it's very good at what it does, if you like that sort of thing. I don't, though. And so what ends up happening here is I can easily recommend it if you're a fan of the original Trine. You'll definitely like more of the same here, only just slightly tweaked. And if you like puzzle platformers, you'll probably like this as well. But if you're like me and you don't really like puzzle platformers, you'll probably just get bored by it. So, ultimately I'm giving this a 3 out of 5, but the thing is, it's that conditional 3 out of 5, where if you're like me and you don't really like puzzle platformers, it's just kind of eh. Whereas, if you like puzzle platformers, it's well worth playing, and I do recommend it for you guys. Thanks for watching.